will now move on to our second ACR plenary, Alex Elias. So Alex received his bachelor's in cognitive science from McGill in 2016 and his master's in linguistics from Leiden in 2018. For his master's thesis, he carried out a phonological description of Leo, an Austronesian language, and a historical analysis of the Central Flores language group. During his master's, he worked as a student assistant at Leiden, working on the NWO project, Reconstructing the Past Through the Languages of the Present, the Lesser Sundas Islands. And then after that, he worked for some time at a language and culture center in Western Australia, helping the Miriwong people to create books and audio resources to revitalize their language. So Alex began his PhD project at UC Berkeley in 2019 under the supervision of Andrew Garrett, looking at methods and models in investigating dialect chains, and is also going to be looking at languages in New Caledonia. However, that's not what he's going to be talking about to us today. Instead, he's going to be telling us a little bit about contact-induced phonological changes in the Lesser Sundas. So Alex, do you want to take it away?
Thank you for that introduction, and I'll just share my screen now. Yes, unfortunately, I have not been able to do any field work in New Caledonia yet, so you'll be hearing about data from my old fieldwork site in Flores. So the title of today's talk is Contrastive Initial Glottal Stops in the Lesser Sundas, the Emergence and Spread of an Areal Sound Pattern. And this little graphic in the back, we see this one consistent pattern being formed from different ingredients, which will be relevant for the rest of this talk. So basically, something I noticed when I did fieldwork in Flores is that there are quite a few languages which have this contrastive initial glottal stop to the point where it can be said to be an areal feature of Flores and a few neighboring islands. So once you start looking into the diachronic origins of these contrastive initial glottal stops, there's a puzzle that emerges, which is that they show this sort of mirror image distribution, which I'll describe shortly. And it's quite puzzling. So it raises a lot of questions about how this sound pattern could have developed. So then in part 3, this will be the main part of the presentation where I present my interpretation of how this sound pattern formed, how it emerged and it spread. And then part 4 will be sort of more of an afterthought, but expanding to take a broader regional view and showing that there are other languages in the area which may also be well analyzed according to this pattern, some of which have been described as such, some of which have not yet. So we're talking about languages of the Lesser Sundas Islands, which are located down here. More specifically, we're talking about the languages spoken in these islands. This small green dot here, Palue, here the island of Flores, the long one, and the island of Lembada. And there are 2 smaller islands here, Adenara and Solor, which don't participate in the sound pattern. So we'll be focusing on the languages of these 3 islands today, and specifically the middle and eastern part of Flores. So Flores is a very beautiful place, Komodo National Park. This is Wikimedia royalty-free images here. The only place in the world where you could see a Komodo dragon. Flores has some really incredible stuff like this volcanic lake at the top of a volcano that changes colors every couple of weeks, and very, very beautiful villages that they built right on the top of the mountain ridges. It's extremely mountainous. So that's to give you a bit of a mental image of where we're talking about. So yeah, basically now I'll describe for you the sound pattern, play you some examples so that you were all on the same page about what actually the sound pattern that is being discussed is. So in 6 languages of the Flores area, this contrast has been described between the presence and absence of a word initial glottal stop. This is a non-neutralized contrast. It's not neutralized in any position, including including utterance initially, for example. So the absence of a glottal stop or a null onset is realized as a brief period of breathiness. So you have an example from Ende language, hage being a fly and age to ask. I'll play some native speakers minimal pairs later, so you can hear that better. Oops, there's a little typo on this one. But basically, if you read McDonald 2009's phonological sketch of Ende, you'll read a very accurate description, which says that the absence of glottal onsets affects the phonetic quality of the vowel. More specifically, vowels without a glottal onset begin with a steady increase in intensity, while the vowels with a glottal onset show a much more abrupt beginning and start at a much higher intensity. Other phonetic qualities of vowels that lack a glottal onset are a longer duration accompanied by lower pitch and breathiness on the vowel. So we're dealing with sort of long breathy segments here. I'm going to write them as voiced H throughout. The original sources, which I will be citing, do not always write it as initial H. They use a wide variety of notational devices for indicating breathiness, but I will be normalizing them all as this H symbol, which will make the argument more clear as well later. So the 6 languages where this is described fall into 2 lowest level subgroups. The Central Flores Palue languages, the 4 which show the pattern are Ende, Keo, Ngata, and Palue. And the 2 Flores Lambada languages which show it are Kedang and Sika. But there's a bit of a difference between these languages. In Ngata and Palue, the contrast is quite marginal, and there's very, very few glottal initial words. So these can be described as languages which they ependicize H in their null onsets, but they don't particularly make use of the available contrast that opens up with glottal initial words. And we'll see historically how this situation arose. So just to show you that I'm not making up this phenomenon, here are some sources which give some examples of minimal pairs. Api for fire, api for wing in Kedang, for instance. Ata, person, versus ata to read in Sika, and so forth. So this is what it sounds like. These are recordings from Kedang collected by Eunice and Marian, Eunice Sulistiono and Marian Klammer. These are available online. So this is what it sounds like with the glottal stop, and you'll notice it to a Western ear, it sounds like regular vowel initial somewhat.
Api, api.
And compare that to
Api, api.
So you can hear that
Api, api.
There are glottal stops at the beginning and end of that word.
Api, api.
And there's a bit of non-modal voicing at the beginning of the vowel in this word.
Api, 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 api.
Let me get to the next. Just one more example.
Ire, ire.
And compare that to
Ire, ire.
So that's the phenomenon being discussed.
Ire, ire.
And this is what it looks like on a spectrogram. The only phonetic investigation of this phenomenon so far was Klammer et al. 2020. They were arguing that Kedang is best described in the way that I'm describing it here. It had been previously analyzed as having phonemic breathy vowels, but it was shown that it was better analyzed as an automatic property of null onsets. And here, if you take a look at the spectrogram, you'll see at the beginning here, there's less energy in the higher frequencies. The energy is shifted to the lower frequencies to be an indicator of breathiness. The voicing lines are less distinct, particularly up here, because there's more noisy energy. And here, if you look at the glottal initial word, you'll see clearly some evidence of creakiness in here, some voicing irregularities as well. But so this is what they look like on a spectrogram. I thought if you're talking about phonetics, might as well show a spectrogram. So let's talk about the subgrouping of these languages. So the West Flores languages don't show patterns like this. This includes Manggarai and other closely related languages. So we're not going to talk about them much more here. Instead, we're going to be talking about these 2 subgroups, Central Flores Palue, which includes these languages here in blue, and Flores Lambada, which includes these languages in red, as well as another language, Alarese, spoken further east, which I won't be talking about either. And within these subgroups, again, not all of them show the pattern. It's just these ones. So Kerang, Sika, Palue, Ende, Keo, and Ngata. So geographically compact, but not necessarily contiguous. They're broken up in many places by languages which do not share this sound pattern. But so this is basically the lay of the land. Now, these are Central Malayo-Polynesian languages. Everyone's familiar with this graph, I'm sure. Within Central Malayo-Polynesian, there's a subgroup that was sort of indirectly proposed without being proposed by BLUS 2008, and then it was further fleshed out and new evidence was brought to bear by Hannah Fricke 2019 in her PhD thesis. So assuming that Bima-Lambada is a valid subgroup, well, these form two branches of it, 2 of 5 branches. And it's, as you can see, it's a group of languages that cross-cuts the well-established subgrouping. So Central Flores and Flores Lambada are not in doubt as proto-languages. There have been a good amount of reconstructions for both of them in these sources. So it's clear that these are the correct lowest level subgroups, and it's clear that this sound pattern is cross-cutting them. So logically speaking, we're dealing with an areal feature. This must have arisen in one language or group of languages and then spread to the others via contact once the process of differentiation had already started. They can't be, this can't be due to common inheritance. So utterance medial position, this contrast basically is, you can think of it as just the presence or absence of a glottal stop. The breathiness is not required in utterance medial position. You could say kauhaje or simply kauaje or even kauwaje with a epenthetic W. So these are, I'll be more interested in this talk about utterance initial position. And this is a big thing. I mean, in languages of the world, why do all languages insert epenthetic segments before vowel initial utterances? Or why is this so common? This is just like the most commonplace possible phonological rule. And the reason, there are good articulatory reasons for this. It's very hard to launch into a vowel initial utterance from rest without some type of non-modal voicing at the beginning. A phonetically vowel initial utterance is a bit unclear what that exactly means, because when you're at rest, you could either have your vocal cords open and you're breathing, in which case, if you want to initiate a vowel, you're going to have to draw the vocal cords together, but there will be some interval in which an H-like segment will be coming out, either voiced or non-voiced. Or you could be at rest with your vocal cords tightly shut and then initiate the vowel from there, which would lead to perception of a glottal stop as you release the glottis. So this is sort of forms a typological spectrum. And you can, and possibly there is some balanced attack where you have no percept of any non-modal voicing at the beginning, but this would be more rare. And so basically I find this gives a nice way of thinking about the phenomena that we're going to be talking about. So this is the typological spectrum that I'm interested in, and I'm going to be looking at how languages move from one area to the other along this spectrum. So basically, I can define something called the default attack type. These are terms that are borrowed more from singing science and voice coaching. But so these are methods of initiating a vowel initial utterance. So these are not the only logical options, but we got breathy attack languages, basically languages with fill null onsets, particularly vowel initial, utterance initial null onsets with some H-like segment. And that's kind of rare. I've found quite a few examples, but it's not that common. And then you have the extremely common type of glottal attack languages, which fill null onsets with a glottal stop. Like we're very familiar with some of these languages, German, Indonesian, and they could fill null onsets at various different levels. It could be only utterance initial, it could be every word, it could be every morpheme, it could be every syllable. And that's another point of typological variation between languages. But basically the languages of this area, which don't participate in the sound pattern that I'm describing here, they're all strict glottal attack languages. You need to insert glottal stops at every word boundary. and it is non-negotiable. So basically you see this, it doesn't matter if it's utterance initial, ine ama aku, you're gonna have to always hear them in Leo, and saapa, how much. And now these are, they could be analyzed as underlying, but this is really the kind of thing that varies between author to author. There's a lot of inconsistency. And just to show you that this is the norm in the area, I'll show you a few neighboring languages. This is Lamahalat, the other Flores Lambada language. In word initial position, the vowel is always preceded by a glottal closure considered to be prothetic, which is similar to the pronunciation of most German words beginning with a vowel. So yeah, that's nothing too surprising. That's the norm regionally. I'm not going to bore you with many examples, but I could reduplicate those examples as necessary for all the neighboring languages, both Papuan and Austronesian. So this is kind of interesting. In Ende, the word for the language itself has no underlying glottal stop. So Ende speakers will say kota Ende, bahasa Ende. They will not say kota Ende, bahasa Ende, which is clearly a mark of being a Leo speaker, say, or Indonesian speaker, where you fill the null onsets with glottal stops automatically. So that's the phenomenon. In these 6 languages, there's this cross-linguistically rare, non-neutralized contrast between glottal stop and null onset. These null onsets are characterized by a period of breathiness, and this general pattern cannot be due to inheritance because the languages belong to various subgroups, which are not all affected, and it must have spread through contact. And furthermore, the other languages of the area are glottal attack languages. Okay, so far so good. So if you look at all this data, you could come away thinking, oh, these languages, they show the same pattern. There's not much more to it. It's just, synchronically, they're all identical, right? But if you then look at the etymology of these words, there's a bit of a conundrum. So you have this vowel initial Proto-Malayo-Polynesian word, apa, and in Ende and Ko, it yields this phonemic initial glottal stop, whereas in these other 4 languages, it yields a phonemic null onset, which ends up being breathy. So there's been some type of split here. They can't all have been following the same diachronic pathway to develop this contrast. So here's a map again, and here we see it, Ko and Ende showing the initial glottal stop, whereas the other languages show the initial breathiness. So this is the mystery, right? So how did this happen? So how did Q and H initial forms merge with vowel initial forms before the time of Proto-Central Flores? And so all these 3 classes of protoforms yield phonemic glottal stops, but breathy null onsets in the other languages. So how did the first language switch from breathy attack to glottal attack and develop this contrast? And how did this pattern then spread to the others? And let's see if we can gather some evidence to try to answer this question. So the obvious question that you'd like to know is, where do breathy null onsets come from in Ende and Ko, and where do glottal onsets come from in the other 4 languages? So here, I will answer that question now. Here we have these vowel initial etyma, which are yielding this split into glottal initial in Ende and Ko, and vowel initial in these 4. Now we'll see that the source of onsetless words in Ende and Ko are these KL clusters. And this is a Proto-Central Flores specific. These are reconstructed for Proto-Central Flores, but they don't behave the same way in Proto-Flores Lambada. So that's why you see all these empty spaces. I'm more concerned with the developments in the 4 Central Flores languages rather than the Flores Lambada languages. And finally, if you look, where do glottal initial words come from in these 2 languages? They come from initial K earlier. So you see the contrast exists robustly in Ende and Ko, where the glottal initial come from vowel initial words and the onsetless come from KL initial words. And it exists robustly in Sika and Kedang, but with completely different sources for the 2 glottal and vowel initial words. And the contrast is marginal in Ngada and Palue because they have no language internal source for glottal initial words. These are languages which are simply breathy attack languages. And this is a bit of a mystery, I would say. This needs explaining, specifically the Ngada and Palue case. Why would they have simply chosen to remove or start using a pattern which is so different from the regional norm. So now I'm going to tie this evidence together into a coherent story now. And the story has 4 steps. The first step is that through a gradual series of phonetically natural, motivated sound changes, Proto-Central Flores KL clusters developed first into this voiced H in Ende and KO. This H was not reanalyzed as a new fricative phoneme, but as a predictable feature associated with null onsets as a prosodic boundary marker. And this had the effect of promoting previously allophonic or previously epenthetic glottal stops to phonemic status in these languages, right? So these are now breathy attack languages because I'm proposing that the proto-languages were themselves glottal attack. So they would have been inserting glottal stops everywhere, but we'll see all these steps in a bit more detail soon. So step 3, once Ende and KO had become breathy attack languages, this phonological rule was adopted sort of wholesale by speakers of these other 4 languages. They simply switched their default attack type. They noticed, oh, Ende has this relatively salient pattern. Ende had a relatively high level of cultural influence in the area, as I'll talk about soon. So it's a very reasonable source for spreading innovation. So I propose that in adopting from Ende, they themselves switched their epenthetic null onset consonant from glottal stop to breathy H. And then the final step is that Sika and Kedang then underwent other sound changes, such as K to glottal stop, which reintroduced initial glottal stops into the system, making them synchronically identical to the Ende sound pattern. So then all of a sudden you find yourself with the contrast again. And so we see that they've recreated the Ende sound pattern, whereas Ngara and Pulue did not undergo any changes that reintroduced glottal initial words, so those remain marginal to this day. So the ancestral state, I propose Proto-Central Flores and Proto-Flores Lambada were glottal attack languages that inserted glottal stops before all words, even utterance medially, as are all of their descendants that don't participate in this sound pattern. We had PMP merger of these 3 segments to initial null, which I interpret as phonetically a glottal stop. So these are the Proto-Central Flores and Proto-Flores Lambada outcomes of these words. So when I say that they developed in a number of phonetically natural directions, what I mean is that these KL clusters, well, they had a very interesting set of reflexes. We see some stops, some sonorants, some fricatives, and this, crucially, this voiced H, which was reanalyzed as the automatic realization of a null onset. So here's an example of a cognate set with a bunch of different Central Flores dialects. You can see that this cannot be attributed to K, it cannot be attributed to L, it must be attributed to its own unique cluster. And the 2 languages which added glottal stop to all their vowel initial words happen to be, or don't happen to be, but causally are the 2 languages in which these KL clusters yield breathy voice and phonemically null onset. So these clusters, you got to be quite careful in reconstructing them because there are no clusters in modern Central Flores languages, but we have pretty good evidence from Sika, which appears to have borrowed some of these Proto-Central Flores terms before its shift from K to glottal stop. So we see exactly what we'd expect for the word fly and the word year if we look at Sika. So this sort of serves as independent confirmation. There was very heavy aspiration of voiceless stops, or there is very heavy aspiration in all Central Flores languages, and it's reasonable to think that it may have existed in Proto-Central Flores, meaning that these KL clusters would very likely have been something like this with a voiceless L, which explains the stranger fricative reflexes like singa for ear from klinga, which has a PMP etymology, talinga, with loss of the first vowel and shift of T to K. So, and then perhaps these other fricative outcomes may have passed through this voiceless L phase, hinga to hinga to hinga to hinga. These are attested in other modern dialects, but they may have been way stations on the way to this voiced H, who knows? But this was just phonetically natural, phonetically driven random neo-grammarian sound change, as if you will. All right, this just shows those outcomes. And then the sort of the magic happened when once these had developed into H, there was this reanalysis, right? So Proto-Central Flores had null onsets, which were realized as glottal stops because it was a glottal attack language, and it had these clusters. Now the clusters turn into H, but it hasn't undergone the reanalysis yet. So the H is still seen as a consonantal phoneme. And then the identity of the null onset sort of flips. It becomes identified no longer with the glottal stop, but with the voiced H. And the glottal stop is promoted to phonemic status. So that's how I propose the switch happened. But why would this happen? And that's a very valid question. Why wouldn't they be just happy with a voiced H-like segment? Well, so if in my proposal, Proto-Central Flores was a language which obligatorily epenthesized glottal stops very, very consistently. And so once these KL clusters developed into a voiced H, that segment was almost imperceptible utterance medially. So as this voiced H started to weaken to the point of being deleted, it began to make more sense synchronically to analyze the very consistent and stable glottal stops at all word boundaries as phonemic, and this unstable and often imperceptible voiced H as just a phonetic detail of a null onset. So once that reanalysis had taken place, the stage was set for other languages to adopt it. Ende is the language of a major city, very widely known language. So I'm proposing that Ngada, for example, as one of many languages, once had glottal attack, and they switched sort of a quantum leap in a way as it developed. Breathy attack sort of imported as a unit from Ende, the whole sound pattern. So here are just a map of the cities in Flores. Ende, 94,000 is the biggest city. This is just evidence that Ende is a reasonable source for a spreading innovation. The KO area is much less reasonable, even though it underwent the very same sound developments, because it's a rural area, quite few people, and without much, there's not many people come to the KO area, whereas many people emigrate to Ende for work or travel. Ende was one of the only written languages in the area. There was this Rajadam of quite long standing. The sound changes we're talking about probably are more recent than 400 years, 300 years. So it's quite likely that Ende was already quite important at the time that these developments were taking place. This is a bit speculative, but given the patterns of contact we see today, it's quite reasonable to suppose that it first spread from Ende to Ngada on the one side and Sika on the other, and then from Sika to Palue and Kedang. Because Palue speakers are relatively isolated with respect to Ende speakers, but they have intense contact with Sika speakers, and similarly for Kedang. But I wouldn't stand by this. It may have spread directly from Ende to all of them. So then the final step is that Sika and Kedang use their own system internal resources to more fully recreate the Ende sound pattern. They undergo sound changes that reintroduce glottal initial words and further expand the contrast, or that further exploit the possibility of a contrast, of a glottal initial contrast that's opened up by switching to breathy attack. So this semi-regular shift of K to glottal stop provided most of the glottal initial words, and there were also new onsetless words generated by sound changes like the loss of H and the loss of W before U. So there's sources both for new glottal initial and new onsetless words, and this raises the level of functional load of this contrast quite a bit. So we see examples of the K to glottal stop shift, which doesn't take place everywhere. You can see the Sika word apparently exceptional. And this has got to be a recent change. We see the Malay kerbau yielding arabau. So that's evidence, good evidence that it's quite recent. So took place in these two languages. And this K to glottal stop change actually really had dramatic consequences for Sika's phonology. At least some dialects of Sika developed phonemic preglottalized resonance from these earlier clusters. And these were systemically very important. They mark the first singular, for instance, in verbal conjugation. So these changes, I propose that they were primed by contact with Ende, which presented them with a template of a language with an initial glottal stop null onset contrast. And these sound changes are not necessarily unusual on their own, but the likelihood of them occurring was vastly increased by the presence of ende in the area. And the final result of this sort of conspiracy of changes is that Kerang and Sika have a synchronically identical sound pattern to ende and ko now. And this sort of reminds me of Tsat, the Chamic language of Hainan Island in China, which came into contact with Sinitic languages and then developed its own disyllabic non-tonal Austronesian vocabulary into monosyllabic, heavily tonal, Sinitic looking vocabulary. So, but it did it through otherwise very well attested tonogenic pathways. It wasn't only by borrowing Chinese loanwords that tone was introduced to Tsat, but it actually underwent the types of sound changes that typically lead to tonogenesis. But the chances of those developments taking place were vastly increased by its contact with its neighboring languages. And here we can see similarly that there was additional sources of null onsets as well as initial glottal stops in Kerang. So yeah, that sums it up. That is the end of my proposal. And yep, so those are the 4 steps. First, the KL becomes a breathy H. The breathy H is reanalyzed as a predictable feature associated with null onsets. Then this breathy attack pattern was exported to Sika, Kerang, Ngada, and Palue. And finally, Kerang and Sika underwent this series of sound changes that led to the synchronically identical pattern. Yep, so how's my time? Perfect. And perhaps some takeaways. What have we learned? If this account is correct, it shows a role for phonological rules in sound change, which is interesting. If it's true that they imported the rule of breathy attack as wholesale, causing a sort of phonetic quantum leap, and it goes against a purely phonetic model of sound change. And yeah, it's a nice illustration of how areal sound patterns form. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for a really interesting talk. Does anyone have any questions? If so, please pop Q in the chat or type your question out. While people are having a think about things, I really enjoyed that. That was it's a really interesting puzzle. I think that it's a compelling story. At least I was a little bit concerned about step 2 until you presented your explanation for that. My question is, so as I understand it, ende is the source, and then you know, the idea was borrowed into other languages. Are there any other linguistic correlates of this contact between ende and the other languages, either in the phonology or elsewhere in the languages?
So the languages that ende is in contact with to the west are its closest relatives, and the similarities are endless. To the east, with the Sika and Kerang, the similarities are, they're a little bit less strong, but you can particularly see a lexical influence on Sika. Sika clearly has borrowed many Central Flores lexemes. Other than that, I mean, there are things that unite the general area. There aren't that many that are specifically shared by those two, but the presence of implosives in the area is quite common. And generally simple phonotactics is a common pattern. But yeah, lexically, there are clearly connections, particularly between Sika and ende. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think Don's got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think you've got a good story there, and I like the lessons that you pulled out at the end. I also was with Laura in wondering about step 2. But my question is, so a lot depends on these initial KL clusters, which I have to assume were not very frequent in the proto-language. So I guess my question is, were they actually super frequent? And if they weren't, do you think that's a problem?
So they are actually surprisingly frequent. For instance, there's this fossilized KL type prefix, like sort of, it's been noted elsewhere for like creepy crawly or spirit world, like Blust wrote a paper about this. So there's this prefix which actually ends up with the form KL on many insects. So insect names, for instance, are overrepresented with this. Like you have lalej being fly in Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, becoming klale. You see accretion of this initial K. Also the word for centipede and the word for locust and a number of other ones. You have words where it seems to have arisen from reduplication, like klaki is the word for male, perhaps some reduction of laki or something, or maybe another fossilized prefix. It actually does have quite a few sources, and there are quite a few of them. And I didn't present the evidence on exceptions. The vast majority of initial breathy null onsets in Ende can be traced to KL. A few cannot. There's a few apparent exceptions in the basic vocabulary, and also the distinction's been extended in the realm of ideophones. So the word for to meow and stuff is going to start with a breathy null onset. So those ones clearly can't be etymologized, but for the majority of cases, it does seem to be KL, and they're actually quite common. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Don Killian has a comment. Maltese also has contrastive initial glottal stops, e.g. he woke up versus he swam, but he doesn't believe they have the breathy attack in null onsets.
Yes. What I would be very interested to see in Maltese is what happens in utterance initial position. And this is something that descriptive sources are typically very bad about specifying. Even in languages with an word initial glottal stop or lack thereof, which for instance occurs in Arabic as well as Maltese. But in Arabic, it's neutralized in utterance initial position by insertion of a glottal stop. So utterance initial position is far more likely to be neutralized than utterance medial position. And the utterance initial ones, I also didn't go into this, but of course, Polynesian is famous for this. And I have yet to put my finger on the correct phonetic interpretation of the Polynesian facts. But that's what I have to say about Maltese. I have looked into the Maltese data, and it seems like it would be neutralized utterance initially.
I have a Maltese friend who actually recorded and asked about this. The impression I get is that it's being preserved as a distinction, even in initial position, somewhat artificially, because it's viewed as the prestige way of speaking. So not all Maltese speakers are using the distinction, it's only some of them. But because it's at the highest level of prestige, it's continuing to be preserved. So some speakers can hear the distinction and can make the distinction even in initial position and isolation and such, but I don't know percentages or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be very interested to see what the phonetics of those null onset would be in isolation. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Owen's got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Really interesting stuff. My question is sort of more of the to do with the synchronic analysis, which is why analyze these as having a null onset? Why not just analyze all words as having an initial consonant, glottal stop, or H, and then you've got, all sorts of other consonants as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one which I grappled with at length. Like I said, synchronically, typically there's not a lot riding on that analysis, and we have a tendency for convenience to analyze it as epenthetic because we don't want to write them everywhere. I've also noticed that it varies between subfields, where Americanists and Africanists often will include all word initial glottal stops and posit them as underlying phonemes, whereas Austronesianists often will not. You really have to look to the larger system to make the decision. And particularly, for instance, in English, we have H initial segments and we have glottal stop initial segments. They both have a defective distribution. They're only used word initially, right? Or morpheme initially. So why couldn't English be analyzed as having an epenthetic H and an underlying glottal stop, or no null onsets? Well, the basic reason is that once you're looking phrase medially, the glottal stop in English is liable to appear and disappear. You can say the apple or the apple, and it doesn't really make a difference. Whereas the word like hat the H is stable across phrase positions. So in these languages, it's exactly the opposite of English. The H is unstable, but the glottal stop is stable. But in terms of the languages which don't show the contrast, so if my story is correct, that kind of shows that you should analyze them as null onsets, because otherwise it wouldn't, the step where Ngada and Sika and Palue adopt it wouldn't quite make sense. If they had, phonologically, they should be equating null onset with null onset, right? Rather, so if in their languages, those phonemic glottal stops were underlying, the glottal stop for phonemic, then that wouldn't make as much sense for the moment where they identify those glottal stop initial words with the null onset words from end eight. I didn't make that argument quite clear, I feel, but yeah, so basically there's a lot to talk about. I would be happy to discuss further with you.
Okay, we have a comment from Natia. In Georgian, we have glottal stops. And then we have a question from Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I couldn't fully understand all the details. I just mentioned one thing about the too many languages in Sulawesi. There are about 10 languages, and 3 of them or 4 of them have phonemic initial glottal stops, and you have nice morphological evidence for them. And for the vowel initial words, you really get these breathy onset kind of things. I mean, I never looked at this very systematically, so I can't tell you that you do it all the time, but I know that you do it in utterance initial position because I have it as on recordings in my word lists. Yeah, so you get happy or wapi as the word for fire. And it was clear enough that I made notes on it and I found it in the thing. So from my point, and the initial glottal stops are clearly all changes from initial K. Yeah, so it's the it's the standard Ku becomes Iu, etc. So this is the standard. It's very clear that you have a K to glottal stop change, and then possibly after that you get a more systematic kind of breathy onset. And that would be the easy way of explaining it to me. But it seems to the story about Ende and Sika, I didn't get why you need to have Ende as someone who sets a model for breathy onsets. If you already have a contrast between glottals and no onset, then you get these breathy onsets, I think.
Yes, so yes, the Sulawesi data is very interesting. I cut out a whole section on that for lack of time. But yes, so it's found in Sulawesi. This pattern is also found near Timor on the island of Dao, a very similar pattern. And so there are other examples in the area. Now, you said that those are languages which show K to glottal stop, right? So that provides an alternate explanation for how this could have arisen. But recall that there are 2 languages in this pattern in Flores, which are Palue and Ngada, which do not have a change K to glottal stop. These are languages which appear to simply have just switched without introducing then a contrast between initial glottal stop and lack thereof, or only a very marginal contrast with a few onomatopoeias and possibly loans. So ultimately, it's to explain the presence of breathy attack on Ngada and Palue. That is much harder to explain. If I saw Sika and Kedang in isolation, they've developed the contrast with a shift K to H. I would happily accept that scenario. And that is, for example, what happened in Polynesian, in some Polynesian languages, like Tahitian and Hawaiian. So that is certainly a possible route. What it leaves to be explained is why the breathiness, why would breathiness be recruited as the null onset in an area where breathiness is quite rare? Of course, in Sulawesi, as you mentioned, it does occur, and there is a potential historical link there. But it would be very Kedang, so the Polynesian languages, when they had K to glottal stop, they did not recruit breathy voice as their null onset. So the introduction of breathy voice into the system is elegantly explained by the KL to H development, I find.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. I think that's about all we have time for. So let's thank Alex again.